UNCTAD, let's just get that out. It's one of those acronyms, abbreviations. United Nations Conference on Trade and Development.
That's right.
Give us the essence of this. If I read it correctly, it's saying Africa needs to grow and will grow, but it's got to do it carefully and not make the mistakes that other industrialized countries made when they started.
That's exactly the message of this report. We know that Africa lags behind in terms of industrialization, in terms of economic transformation. So we say Africa needs to do that, needs to transform its economies, but in a way that does not make the same mistakes that were made by early industrializers in terms of pollution. So Africa needs to do it carefully, by trying to have as little impact as possible on the environment.
Easier said than done, though, and one thinks of South Africa, for example, where everyone agrees that the carbon emissions from the big coal-fired power stations are unacceptable and we've got to do something about it. But for 20, 30 years, coal will remain our major source of energy. So one thing to say, another to do.
No, that's right. I mean, we're not saying in that report that it's easy to do, but we're starting a conversation. We're starting a conversation which really needs to attract the attention of policymakers all over the continent, that it is very important to take into account the fact that technologies now, processes now are getting towards the green processes, green technologies. So Africa needs to start thinking ahead and thinking about how to do this. One way to do it is really to try and take advantage of the opportunities that the continent has. I can give two examples. One example is hydropower. We know that Africa is endowed with huge streams in some places, huge water reserves that can be used to produce electricity wherever it is economically viable and environmentally viable. I know in some places it's not environmentally viable, but there are places where it is. The example of the Inga Dam, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, if it was fully exploited, some people say it could fuel the whole continent in terms of electricity generation. The second example is North Africa and solar power. North Africa is a huge, huge potential.
We have lots of sun. That's one thing we do have lots of.
Exactly. So let's try and think about using this. Of course, technologies are in some cases are not easy to master. But this is a conversation we're starting, and we think countries will take it up and try to see in the future, in 20 years, where will we be in terms of energy generation and energy use.
Looking at some of your statistics, you say that the per capita domestic material consumption of 5.3 tons in Africa is about half the global average. So, but that is increasing, is it? It
is increasing, but really the key number here to keep in mind is it is half of the world's average, which means Africa is not really extracting as much resources as the rest of the world. So what we say, there is some room for Africa to extract even more, provided that it is using these material resources more efficiently. So what we say is, no, Africa should not stop extracting its natural resources. No, it should do it, but in a way that is more efficient, meaning any additional extraction should produce more output than it has been so far. That's the notion of efficiency.
Will African countries be able to do this on their own? Do they need help? Do they need the countries, for example, that are extracting minerals to also come to the party and not just come in and have a second scramble for Africa where they pillage the continent's resources and then disappear?
That's exactly what the report says. Africa has to make this as a key priority focus, but it cannot do it on its own. And we know that environment degradation is not a one country's problem. It's a global problem. So the global community should come and help Africa to do this correctly. What we say, for example, is technology. We know that some of the technologies are not currently accessible by many African countries. So technology transfer should be one of the areas where the global community should come in and help Africa to adopt new technologies. Finance is another issue. Of course, these technologies and these processes will require more finance. The global community, again, is invited to come and help Africa to really change the way of doing business in terms of pollution, in terms of the harm to the environment.
You would expect, presumably, also private sector companies, not governments, but companies that are mining, for example, that are in agriculture, that are coming into Africa, to not just come in and say, well, the local regulations don't require us to do certain things, so we're not going to do them. Presumably, you'd want a proactive approach. So even though the local regulations don't require us to, we do need to be more responsible and have sustainable practices. Can you see that happening?
We can see that happening. We can see that happening because we are more and more aware of the need to really to go green, as most people put it. And we know that even in some cases, we see some private companies coming in and adopting new ways of corporate governance, being more careful about the damage to the environment, being more proactive in terms of community, helping the communities where they work. So we see this thing happening, but what we want really to, what we highlight in this report, this has to be generalized. The problem of environmental conservation in Africa has to be seen as a development issue, not just an African local issue. It's a global development issue. So anyone coming in, whether it's government, whether it's private sector, they need to come with this in mind, so that, because it's for the good of all of us. It's not just for Africans.
What happens now with this report? Because there are many shelves full of big reports which are lying gathering dust, not necessarily yours, but that's the way it works. Reports are done and action doesn't always happen. What are the next steps here?
No, the next step, first of all, let me remind the people who are listening to us that this week and next week in Rio de Janeiro will be this huge conference on the environment, 20 years after the first conference. So there is this huge debate on these issues. And it's not a new, it's not a new debate. So it's an ongoing debate. So this report is really our kind of contribution to this conversation. We're not stopping here. We're going to continue raising these issues, and I'm sure further reports will come out, probably by me or my institution, and by some other institutions, because it's so important that we can't just write one report and say that we're done. So more will come, for sure.
You also make an interesting point about intellectual property rights, global intellectual property rights, which comes as a bit of a surprise in a document like this. What's that referring to?
It's not actually a surprise, because some of the problems that the continent faces is access to technologies. So when you want to access technologies, you have to pay a huge amount of money that, if you are a poor country, you don't have. Now, if property rights were relaxed a little bit, for example, saying that for a poor country, you won't have to pay for property rights to access this specific technology, or you pay a very discounted amount. That's what we mean. Relaxing property rights so that they can be accessible to the poorest of the poor in Africa.
Do you see the United Nations or other governments subsidizing the holders of the intellectual property rights in compensation?
What we know is that property rights, when they are, when something is invented, they give the inventor a number of years. I don't remember if it's 20 years or something like that, to benefit really from the invention. But we know that maybe after a few years, the company or the person who has invented has already recouped his cost. So what we mean is, for such technologies where, for example, the costs have already been recouped, even before the 20-year period is over, maybe those technologies should be made accessible for poor countries or even for other countries, provided they are for the good of the global community. So that's the argument. We don't necessarily mean that they should be subsidized or whatever, but they recoup their price, their costs, and then technologies should be made available.
A lot of common sense there, and hoping that Africa does not make the same mistakes that many other countries made in industrializing. That was Janvier Nkurunziza, who is economist at UNCTAD's Division on Africa.